All right, get this. What if a computer could learn, but not with code, with actual living brain cells? It sounds like science fiction, right? Well, today we're going to unpack the totally wild, true story of how scientists taught a brain in a dish to fly a fighter jet. Yeah, you heard that right. Let's dive in.
So, this whole thing kicked off back in 2004. A team of scientists were looking at these super complex digital autopilots and thought, what if we could do this a completely different way? Could we build a system that learns and adapts not with ones and zeros, but biologically?
And here is where it gets absolutely crazy. The autopilot they created wasn't made of silicon or programmed with code. Nope. It was built from, arguably the most powerful computer material in the universe, living neurons. Specifically, they were from a rat's brain.
Okay, so this is the setup. It looks complicated, but it's actually a pretty elegant loop. You've got the brain in a dish over here, and it's hooked up to an F-22 flight simulator. The simulator sends flight data to the brain cells. The cells react, and a computer reads that reaction, turning it into flight commands for the jet. It's this continuous circle where a living, disembodied brain is literally the pilot. I know what you're thinking. How on earth is this even possible? I mean, how do you take a bunch of cells in a dish and get them to fly a plane? It sounds impossible. Well, that's exactly what we're about to break down. So, to get our heads around this, we have to look at the big picture. And here's the key thing to remember. The brain doesn't know it's flying a jet. It has no idea. The whole secret is in a constant, simple back and forth, a feedback loop between the simulator and the brain cells. Okay, so let's walk through that loop step by step. First, the simulator sends out the plane's flight data. Let's say the jet banks a little to the right. That info, that banking right data, gets turned into a specific pattern of electrical pulses. Then, those pulses get sent to the neurons, stimulating them. The neurons fire back with their own unique electrical signal. A computer reads that signal and basically translates it into a command, something like, hey, adjust the left wing to level out. That command goes back to the plane corrects itself, and boom, the loop starts all over again with the new stable flight data. All right, so that's the process, the how it works. But what about the what? What is this brain in a dish actually made of? Let's look at the living hardware that's doing all the heavy lifting here. The heart of the whole system is this little thing right here, a microelectrode array, or MEA. The easiest way to think about it is like a super smart petri dish. It has this grid of 60 tiny electrodes on the bottom, and they work like a two-way street. They can send signals to the brain cells and listen for the signals the cells send back. Now, on top of this grid, the scientists put about 25,000 neurons. And this is where the magic happens. Over a few days, those cells just spontaneously start reaching out to each other. They form connections, building this dense, living network all on their own. They create a tiny, functioning brain circuit right there in the dish. Okay, so we've got our hardware, this living network on the MEA. But hardware is nothing without software, right? So how in the world do you program a bunch of living cells to fly a jet?
Well, it all comes down to a concept called neural weights. See, in any brain, yours, mine, or rats, learning happens by changing the strength of the connections between neurons. Think of it like turning up or down the volume. A strong connection means one neuron really influences the next one. A weak connection means it barely has an effect. So the whole trick was figuring out how to control those connections.
And this is the really clever kind of backwards part. To tell the brain it was doing a good job flying stable and level, they sent it high-frequency pulses. Now, you'd think that would excite the brain, right? Nope. It actually calmed the network down, weakening connections. It was like saying, okay, good, just chill out, do less. But when the plane needed to correct itself, they sent low-frequency pulses. This did excite the network, strengthening connections. It was like saying, whoa, pay attention, do more of that. So by giving it this feedback, they literally taught it to create the right signals for flying straight. So we've got the hardware, we've got the software, we've got a living brain wired up to a fighter jet. The big question is, did it actually work? The answer, and I'm quoting directly from the researchers here, is a pretty definitive yes. They wrote that the network essentially learned to act as an autopilot. It was actually adjusting the plane's controls to keep it flying straight and level. Amazing. But of course, in science, it's never quite that simple. So what did the flight report actually say? Well, the good news was incredible. This little bio-autopilot kept the plane stable, controlling both its up and down pitch and its side-to-side roll. Pretty impressive. But there was a catch. Because the training signals were constant, the brain connections could get, well, too strong. The brain started to overcorrect, trying way too hard to fix tiny little errors, which made the plane start to wobble a bit. So this experiment was way more than just a cool party trick. It really blew the doors open on how we think about what a computer is, what learning is, and that blurry line between biology and machines. Which brings us to the big kind of sci-fi question, right? Is the end game here to have fleets of drones flown by, rat brains in jars? No. The researchers are very clear about that. Absolutely not. The F-22 simulator was just a really interesting, complex job to give the brain. The real goal was something much, much deeper. To understand how living things compute in the first place. How do they process information? How do they learn? How do they adapt? And that opens up some really mind-bending possibilities for the future. I mean, think about it. This whole experiment only used 2 of the 60 electrodes to control the plane. What if you used all 60? Could you, say, flash a simple pattern onto the brain and then see if it could recognize a different version of that same pattern later? That's the real holy grail here, to figure out how to use these living networks as actual general-purpose biological computers. So what's the big takeaway here? This experiment just completely blurs the line between what we think of as biology and technology. It kind of suggests that learning, at its very core, isn't really about books and memory. It's about adaptation. It's about response. And look, when a simple collection of cells in a dish can figure out how to fly a fighter jet, it really makes you stop and ask a pretty profound question. What does it actually mean to learn or to be intelligent in the first place?